don't think I've been this polarized on a movie in a long time. Now, I know I just did In a Violent Nature, where I commended its concept but disliked its execution. But that kind of split between concept and execution is fairly common in horror movies. This movie is far more rare, where the split itself for me is inside the story. A Quiet Place Day One is a 2024 movie about a dying woman in hospice care trying to navigate her way through Manhattan after the first day of an alien invasion. Oh, and this is also a prequel to A Quiet Place. This movie was written and directed by Michael Sarnowski, whose last movie was Pig, an excellent Nicolas Cage movie about a former famous chef who is now a recluse living in the woods when his friend and truffle-finding pig gets stolen from him. He then goes on a journey to get him back, and although that sounds like a John Wick wannabe, it ends up being a very deeply personal film. Actually, it turns out to be a very moving road to redemption, as well as learning how to process grief and letting things go. Now imagine you took that film and just slapped some cartoon aliens into it. So we're going to break this up a little bit between the story and the framing of said story. Now, the framing of this movie is it's the first day of the A Quiet Place aliens/monsters attacking Earth. Now, this is the moment where they hit New York City. It also happens to be while a whole group of hospice care patients are visiting the city in order to watch a puppet show. But the story itself is about one of the patients, Samira, who's basically surpassed all the prognostications on how much longer she has to live, and is facing potentially her last time being in the city that she lived and grew up in. And she decides that, despite the aliens' arrival all around her, that she's going to leave her group that's heading off the island to walk from Chinatown to Harlem in order to relive a simple childhood memory as her last act, which is getting pizza. So for the time being, let's just put aside the framing of this movie. Like, we're just going to put a pin in it and focus on the Samira storyline for a second. Now, I loved this storyline. It's such a deeply emotional theme, and it highlights a type of story that we don't really see much in horror films. Like, horror films tend to focus on an external threat, a monster, a ghost, a demon, a killer, and obviously this deals with that too. But really, her story is about trying to win against a demon that's growing inside of her. It's a fight against the unseen enemy that's inside our bodies that sometimes decide to just simply revolt against us, and that's tragic. The aliens here are just the equivalent of a dangerous countryside, or a flooded river to navigate, or an ocean to cross. It's there to make the central journey harder, but it's not the central journey itself. Now, to complement those kind of heady themes, the acting here is fantastic. Lupita Nyong'o is able to carry so much weight with her performance through these subtle acts and minimal dialogue. Now, her story is both resilient and heartbreaking. There are some excellent character beats here, and the quiet reflection throughout her character's journey is just excellent. This is a very simple human story about trying to wrest some control over a body that's taken the most precious thing that she has, time, regardless of the circumstances that's around her. She's not trying to save the world or discover a cure or figure out how to stop the aliens from invading. She's just trying to survive long enough to give herself some peace. Unfortunately, along the way, she meets Eric, who is a person, I guess? I mean, it's hard to think of a more useless character in a movie than Eric. Like, certainly not one that's so prominently displayed and central to a movie. Like, it's one thing when you have meaningful dialogue between characters that allows them to open up more as opposed to being alone. But in this movie, you can't really talk much, except for the most straightforward of expository dialogue. So he's just sort of a person, like no more or less than the hundreds of others we see in this film. Nothing about his character is interesting or unique or compelling. If you removed him whole cloth from this film and she was on her own the entire time, it would have been such a better movie. And he would be the worst part of this film, except for the next thing. Okay, remember that pin that we put into the framing device? It's time to pull that out. But I warn you, this is going to get a little bit messy. Now, as I've said, the story I just described is such a lovely angle for this kind of a movie, and it's unique in its delivery. But unfortunately, the monsters are so ridiculously over-the-top cartoony that it wrecks the deeper human story that it's trying to tell. So I'm going to get into some mild spoilers here. So if you don't want to hear that, or me just railing against the monsters in this movie, just feel free to skip ahead. Now, as full disclosure for this franchise, just so you know sort of where I'm coming from, I liked the original A Quiet Place all right. Now, I wasn't doing this channel at the time, but I probably would have given it a B or a B-. It was an entertaining concept, and it was well shot and executed some really nice, tense set pieces. I mean, having Emily Blunt, who's an A-list actor, always helps, but it just made some questionable choices. Like, I still don't understand how you can have a deaf character in The Daughter, but then never put her in any danger because of that disability. Like, if I couldn't hear, how would I know how quiet I was being? And throughout the movie, it sort of continues to wreck its tension by showing too much of the aliens. Now, the second one I have seen, but honestly, I remember almost nothing of it. Like, suffice to say, it was very forgettable. Like, I remember a boy locked in an oven, I think. So, to be honest, when this prequel came out, I wasn't exactly excited about it. But I did really like Pig, as I mentioned at the top. And being in New York City is an interesting setting for a creature that hunts by sound. Like, surely, if rainfall and waterfalls can mask the sound to these creatures, then that just means any droning, ongoing sound would also mask it, right? But anyway, suffice it to say, I hated everything about the framing aspect of this story. I just found the aliens so ridiculous in so many ways that I think my eyes were rolling constantly. Like, let's start with the central idea that in less than 24 hours of the attack, everyone is immediately aware how quiet they need to be. I mean, I know Samira got knocked out in the initial attack and was out for an undisclosed time, but it seems like it's only been for a few hours. Yet it's like she got knocked out and woke up in the first movie where weeks or months have passed. Yet we know that that didn't happen because Eric swims up from the subway, so I doubt that he was underwater for days. I mean, in the previous movie, it's months after the attack. And even in the flashbacks, we see characters kind of realizing that they need to be quiet and that the aliens are blind otherwise. In this, it felt like they just shortcutted it. It's like everyone in this movie had actually watched the first two movies. Like, they didn't want to spend time on rediscovering why they had to be so quiet, so they just cut to the chase. Especially the fact of how much they know to keep quiet and the fact that these monsters can't see. Like, yes, there is a helicopter that tells people to stay quiet, but there is stay quiet, and then there's these creatures that can hear a pin drop from a mile away. And there's nothing in the announcement of these aliens being blind, yet there are droves of people just walking right down the middle of the street. Not a care in the world. I mean, just because something has good hearing, you don't immediately assume it's blind. You would only really know that from extended exposure. Also, I can't not get back to the fact that an attack on New York City would be pretty noisy for a really long time given the destruction that they're showing here. It would not be deathly quiet within hours. Not to mention their ability to be seemingly nowhere and then everywhere at the drop of a hat. Or, in this case, a book. Which brings me to my biggest problem with this world. The wildly inconsistent nature in which the monsters work. It's one of the reasons I've never been a huge fan of this series, is just how the creatures themselves' abilities shift from scene to scene, depending on the need for what's going on. It's like playing a video game where the difficulty setting of the monsters change depending on the situation that you're in. Like, they can somehow hear something drop and be there in seconds, but yet they also attack a city like New York, which, as the opening statement in the movie says, has a constant noise level of 90 decibels. Now, I would think a creature with extreme sensitivity to sound, the city would be the last place it would want to go. I mean, for God's sakes, I still see people having to block their ears in the subway sometimes. And that's just people with normal hearing. In the world of this movie, if just water and rain is enough to mask a person's voice, then why wouldn't the near constant hum of the city not do the same thing? Like, wouldn't that give the humans a little bit of an advantage? Because the entire city should essentially be cloaked in noise. But no. The way the monsters seemingly can zero in on the slightest of sounds and follow those victims to the end of the earth until, of course, someone kicks a can 100 yards away, and then for some reason they change course and then must chase that new sound instead, like some sort of Pavlovian dog, is just crazy. And it makes the monsters at a cartoon level intelligence. Theoretically, a creature that lives entirely on sound should be able to differentiate between the noises that are relevant and the ones that are not. Okay, so out of all that, this might be my biggest hot take. And I'm sure I'm going to lose a lot of you on this one. But I have to talk about the cat in this movie. So Samira has a cat on a leash at the beginning of the film. Immediately I thought that was an interesting idea. Because in a world where alien monsters can hear the smallest of sounds, how do you keep an animal quiet? It's a nice added element to the tension of the film, if it was actually used. But fuck that fucking cat. I have never wanted an animal to die more in a movie or TV show since maybe Uni in the old Dungeons & Dragons cartoon. Also, I swear to God, if it had been revealed that that cat was actually an intergalactic space marine that had been sent to Earth to fight the aliens, or it was the soul of her dead father and that cat was all actually in her head, I don't think that would have been more implausible than what the cat does in this movie. I mean, thankfully, apparently that cat saw the previous movies as well, because it knew not to make any sounds or it would get killed. So, I mean, that thing gets confronted by monsters, mice, fire, water, explosions, and it is deathly quiet. Now, I have many friends with cats, and I've fed them many times where they're out of town. Now, I remember one cat would meow constantly from the time I arrived to the time I left. One would hiss at me if I got within 5 feet of her, and one would just randomly scream at like 3 a.m. The fact that nothing that this cat encounters causes it to make a fucking peep the entire movie despite everything is mind-boggling on the level of absurdity. And speaking of useless plot devices, I have to go back and talk about Eric again. Like, what was the point of Eric? I have no idea why he was in this movie. His character is so shallow, he's just completely useless. We learn next to nothing about him. He inexplicably is the only person that surfaces from a flooded subway. He finds Samira and then just kind of tags along, despite the fact that, from his perspective, she is clearly out of her mind. Like, we as an audience understand that she's decided to die. But an alien invasion just happened. Everyone's getting killed. They said to head to the South Street Seaport. And she says she's going to go to Harlem to get pizza. And he's just like, yeah, I like pizza. Like, here's the thing. This wouldn't be so bad if it was actually set up better. If Eric was looking out for her and concerned with her well-being, that could make sense, where he realizes that she isn't going to survive and wants to help her. Maybe she saves his life the first time they meet and he feels responsible for her, or vice versa. And I guess that's kind of what happens eventually. But when he runs into her on the street, he's a shell of a human being, just kind of following her blindly. She says she's going to get pizza, and he's just like, okay, let's do that. He should be like, lady, we got to get out of here. Instead, he just goes along. Like, I could see a version where this works, but not as presently played. If this was the nurse played by Alex Wolff, I could see this, where there's a clear history between the two, and he cares for her. But this guy is a total stranger who just immediately starts following her around because she's the first person he sees. In the end, this is a hard movie to review, given how split I am on this film. On the one hand, I loved the human side of the story and the angle in which it took. On the other, I just hated everything about the aliens as a movie monster. They're far too convenient a villain. Now, the acting is really top-notch by Lupita, and her nurse, played by Alex Wolff, is always a welcome performer. I just wish he was the one with her the whole movie, and then the movie makes some kind of sense as to why he's sticking with her the entire time. Instead, we get Joseph Quinn, who plays Eric like a dumbstruck puppy dog with no real agency of his own. I guess my simple take on this is, if you like the monsters in the previous movie, you'll probably enjoy this movie because it's taking those monsters and adding a better story to it. But if you raised eyebrows at any of the monsters' abilities in the past, this one goes further than that and might be a bit too much for you as well. The human element of this story is really the meat of it. I just wish that they surrounded it by a better class of alien. I'd give this movie a C, but let me know what you think.